Somewhere in the limestone bedrock beneath Springfield, Missouri, the United States is sitting on more than 1 billion pounds of cheese. Estimates from the Department of Agriculture have put the national surplus north of 1.4 billion pounds in recent years, stored in vast underground caverns cut decades ago for mining, now converted into some of the largest cold storage facilities on Earth. That is more cheese, by weight, than the Statue of Liberty and the Great Sphinx of Giza, combined several times over, sitting in the dark at a steady 36 degrees, waiting for someone to eat it. Hundreds of trucks move through these cold, dim tunnels every week, a subterranean logistics operation most Americans have never heard of, built to manage a problem most Americans don't know exists. And the reason it exists at all has almost nothing to do with cheese, and everything to do with a promise the government made to dairy farmers more than 50 years ago, a promise nobody has ever quite figured out how to unwind. The underlying problem is biological, and it cannot be switched off. A dairy cow does not stop producing milk because the market has enough of it. She keeps producing on a fixed biological schedule, twice a day, every day. And unlike a car factory, a herd cannot simply pause the line when demand softens. Milk is also highly perishable in its raw form, so the only way to store a surplus for any meaningful length of time is to convert it into something shelf-stable. And cheese is one of the most efficient ways to do that, locking milk solids into a form that can last for years if kept cold enough. So when policy or market shifts caused milk production to consistently outrun what Americans were drinking and eating fresh, that surplus had nowhere to go except into the one form that could actually be stockpiled, block after block, wheel after wheel of cheese. That stockpile exists because of a very specific policy decision made in a very different economic era. Starting in the 1970s, under the Dairy Price Support Program, the federal government guaranteed to buy any surplus butter, milk powder, and cheese at a fixed price, a safety net designed to protect dairy farmers from the price collapses that had periodically wiped out entire farming communities. It worked exactly as designed, and then some. Farmers responded to the guaranteed floor by producing more, because more production at a guaranteed price is simply rational, and the government, obligated by its own program, kept buying the excess. Officials dried it, froze it, and pressed it into cheese, then needed somewhere to put it. Decommissioned limestone mines turned out to be close to perfect. Natural caves hold a nearly constant cool temperature and humidity without the enormous energy cost of refrigerating an above-ground warehouse of the same size, and Missouri's geology, riddled with old mine shafts, happened to sit near the center of the country's dairy belt. Springfield's cave network became one of the largest hubs for exactly that purpose, almost by accident of geography. The caves themselves predate the cheese entirely. Limestone quarrying in the region dates back over a century, and once a mine was worked out, the resulting cavern was simply an empty, structurally sound, climate-stable void carved into rock, exactly the kind of space that would otherwise sit unused. A few hundred miles north, a similar formation beneath Kansas City became one of the largest underground business parks in the country, leased out for everything from film archives to industrial manufacturing, proof that this region's abandoned mines had already become valuable real estate long before anyone started stacking cheese inside them. Not all of that surplus stayed hidden underground either. In the 1980s, the federal government began distributing large volumes of the stockpiled cheese directly to low-income Americans through food assistance programs, an effort to draw down the reserve that instead became a defining cultural memory for an entire generation. Blocks of bright orange processed cheese, unofficially nicknamed government cheese, showed up in food banks and welfare distribution centers nationwide, dense, shelf-stable, and instantly recognizable, later referenced in songs, television, and stand-up comedy as shorthand for poverty-era Americana. It was, in effect, a one-time release valve for a surplus the government had spent a decade accumulating, and it barely made a dent in the total. These caves are still structurally mines, and that comes with its own engineering burden. Structural engineers inspect roof bolts and support pillars on a recurring schedule, because a cavern stable enough to store cheese for years is only stable as long as its ceiling is actively maintained, and a collapse in a working storage facility would be a catastrophic loss of both product and, potentially, life. The plants feeding this system today look nothing like a traditional creamery. Modern lights-out cheese factories use continuous multi-story production lines. Raw milk enters one end, and through a sequence of standardized steps in massive steel vats and presses, finished cheese exits the other, curd cut, salted, pressed, and formed into blocks with minimal direct human handling. Some of the largest plants can turn out tens of thousands of pounds of cheese in a single hour, running around the clock in a way that would have been unrecognizable to a cheesemaker even 2 generations ago. The economics only make sense at that scale. The machinery is enormously expensive, so the plants that survive are the ones large enough to run it continuously, which pushes the entire industry toward fewer, bigger, more automated facilities every year. The dairies feeding those plants have industrialized just as heavily. On the largest operations, cows walk voluntarily onto giant rotating milking platforms, sometimes called carousels, that can cycle several hundred animals through an automated milking process in a single hour, robotic arms attaching and detaching equipment as the platform slowly turns. The largest of these rotary parlors can process several hundred cows in a single hour, a throughput that would have required dozens of workers on a traditional stanchion barn a generation ago. Some farms have gone a step further with fully robotic milking systems that let cows choose when to be milked, day or night, with no human present at all. Sensors verifying each animal's identity and monitoring milk quality in real time before it ever reaches a shared line. It is a stark contrast to the small family barn most people still picture when they think of a dairy farm, and it reflects a broader consolidation. The number of individual dairy farms in the United States has fallen for decades, even as total milk production has kept climbing, because the surviving operations are simply larger. Before that milk becomes cheese, it passes through massive steel standardization silos, where its fat and protein content is precisely adjusted and blended, so that a block of cheddar made this week tastes essentially identical to one made the same week the year before, regardless of which farm or which season the milk actually came from. Once cheese reaches the caves, it doesn't just sit there passively decaying into a monument. In aging warehouses built for products like Parmesan, robotic arms slide 90-pound wheels off wooden shelving to brush, flip, and inspect them on a fixed schedule for months, or, for the hardest-aged cheeses, years at a time, a task that would be physically exhausting to do by hand at that scale, every single day without error. Climate-controlled chambers hold humidity and temperature within a narrow tolerance because a wheel of cheese aging for 2 years represents a meaningful capital investment sitting untouched, generating no revenue until the day it finally leaves the cave. The entire aging operation functions less like traditional food storage and more like a highly automated industrial process that happens to produce something you'd put on a cracker. The popular image of a single secret federal cheese bunker also understates who actually owns what's down there. Much of that storage space is not government-held at all. Private commercial cold storage operators lease and manage large sections of the same cave systems, storing product for food companies and commodity traders alongside whatever portion the government or its dairy cooperatives still hold directly. That mix of public and private storage, often supported by state and local tax incentives designed to attract cold storage investment, means the sprawling cave network is shaped as much by commercial logistics deals as by any single government program. Ownership at the production end is concentrated too. A handful of large dairy cooperatives and processing corporations account for a disproportionate share of the country's cheese output, which means decisions about how much to produce and how much to store versus sell sit with a relatively small number of institutions rather than thousands of independent farms making that call individually, and it gives private traders a strong financial interest in exactly how much cheese sits in reserve at any given moment, since inventory levels can move commodity prices. Every wheel in storage is also tracked and tested. Quality inspectors pull samples on a rotating schedule to check moisture content, bacterial safety, and aging progress, because a facility holding tens of millions of dollars of inventory cannot afford to discover a spoiled section only when a customer complains, and USDA grading standards still apply to products sitting in a cave, exactly as they would on a factory floor. Almost nothing that goes into a block of cheese is wasted, even the parts most consumers never think about. For every pound of cheese produced, roughly 9 pounds of liquid whey are drained off as a byproduct, a greenish, nutrient-rich runoff that used to be treated as an expensive and genuinely hazardous environmental disposal problem, capable of stripping oxygen out of a waterway if it was ever dumped untreated. Today, it is dried and processed into whey protein powder, a multi-million-dollar ingredient sold into everything from sports nutrition supplements to infant formula, turning what was once a liability into one of the more profitable byproducts in the entire dairy industry, and giving processors a second revenue stream that helps offset the cost of running an enormous cheese plant in the first place. Even the salty brine left over from certain cheese-making steps gets reused in some plants, repurposed as a de-icing agent for winter roads. One more example of an industry that has learned to extract value from every stage of a process most consumers assume ends the moment the cheese is cut into blocks. The economic engine that tries to shrink the surplus is a program most consumers have never heard of. The dairy checkoff, created by federal law in 1983 and funded by a mandatory fee assessed on dairy farmers themselves, whether they want to pay it or not. Its stated purpose is to boost demand for dairy products broadly, and its primary vehicle, an organization called Dairy Management Inc., has spent decades working directly with major food companies to put more cheese into more products. That program has funded product development partnerships with national pizza and fast food chains, helping engineer extra cheese menu items and running national advertising campaigns encouraging Americans to eat more of it, all funded indirectly by the same government-backed system that helped create the surplus in the first place. One widely cited internal case study even credited a checkoff-funded partnership with a major pizza chain for helping add hundreds of millions of pounds of cheese demand over several years, precisely the kind of engineered demand the program was designed to manufacture. It is a closed loop that rarely gets examined in public. Subsidize production, end up with too much cheese, then subsidize demand to help absorb it, with farmers themselves footing the bill for both ends of the cycle. The system's stability increasingly depends on selling the surplus somewhere else entirely, because domestic demand alone cannot absorb everything the industry now produces. Record levels of American cheese are shipped overseas every year, and that growing dependence on exports makes the whole structure vulnerable to a single disruption. A new tariff, a trade dispute, or a foreign competitor undercutting the price on the world market can instantly strand product that has nowhere else to go, pushing more of the surplus right back into cold storage rather than onto a plate anywhere in the world. Mexico, Japan, South Korea, and a handful of other major buyers account for the overwhelming majority of that export volume, which means the entire program's stability rests on maintaining favorable terms with a relatively short list of trading partners rather than a broad, diversified customer base. A single tariff announced overseas can, within weeks, reverse years of hard-won export gains and send storage volumes climbing again, because the caves have effectively become the shock absorber for a national industry with no other release valve. That consolidation has a human cost that rarely makes it into the export statistics. As dairy farming has industrialized, the small family operations that once defined rural dairy communities across the Midwest and Northeast have closed at a steady pace for decades, unable to compete with the economics of scale that carousel parlors and multi-story cheese plants demand. The workers and communities built around those smaller farms have had to adapt to an industry that increasingly rewards size above almost everything else, even as the technology that replaced them keeps getting more capable of running with less direct human labor every year. The people still working inside the plants and the caves today do jobs that resist full automation even now. Mechanics who keep a rotary parlor's hundreds of moving parts running through the night, technicians who calibrate the sensors on a robotic milker, and inspectors whose trained sense of smell and texture still catches problems no machine has been built to detect. Looking forward, the surplus shows no sign of resolving itself because nothing about its underlying cause has fundamentally changed. A production system that is biologically incapable of pausing, combined with a policy structure built to keep buying the excess and a checkoff program built to keep manufacturing demand for it, continues to push more raw milk toward conversion into blocks destined for the same limestone tunnels. Climate stress on feed crops threatens to make milk production less predictable, even as the structural incentives to overproduce remain fully in place. Corn and soybean prices, the backbone of modern dairy cattle feed, swing with drought and extreme weather just as unpredictably as the herds that depend on them, and a bad feed crop year can squeeze dairy margins from the opposite direction of oversupply, even while the cave inventory keeps growing regardless. Consumer habits have shifted in the industry's favor in one narrow sense, with Americans drinking far less fluid milk than a generation ago, but eating meaningfully more cheese. Yet, even that shift hasn't been enough to outpace the sheer volume the industry is capable of producing. Periodic proposals to reform or wind down the price support structure have gone nowhere, because doing so would mean absorbing real immediate pain in dairy farming regions that still carry outsized political weight. At the same time, the rise of plant-based milk and cheese alternatives has added a new, unpredictable variable to a system built around assumptions from the 1970s, chipping away at fluid milk sales even as it has so far done little to slow the underlying cheese surplus itself. The caves keep getting fuller, not emptier, and the entire apparatus built to manage that surplus, from robotic aging rooms to fast food menu partnerships to a growing export machine vulnerable to the next trade dispute, exists to manage a problem the system itself keeps recreating every single day. It is easy to grab a bag of shredded cheese without thinking about any of this. But behind that simple dairy product sits a 50-year-old federal promise, a cave full of frozen surplus heavier than a national monument, and a marketing program quietly shaping what shows up on a fast food menu near you. A single case sitting in a store cooler is, quietly, the tail end of a 50-year chain of policy, engineering, and marketing most shoppers will never think twice about. That is the quiet complexity behind almost everything on a supermarket shelf. If you want more stories behind the hidden systems that stock the world's supermarkets, consider subscribing.